Welcome back to Business Week on Arise News. Today, we take a hard look at Nigeria's economy 64 years after independence. From being an agricultural powerhouse in the 1960s to the discovery of oil that transformed its fortunes, Nigeria's economy has been a story of highs and lows. Despite its huge potential, face persistent challenges. In fact, Nigeria's economy has seen it all. Today, double-digit inflation, unemployment is pretty high, and a heavy dependence on oil, which still accounts for nearly 90% of our export earnings. There's a saying that Nigeria never misses an opportunity to miss an opportunity. But with a youthful population of over 200 million, can we turn this tide and finally unlock our potential? Fiscal management, policy inconsistencies, and a public sector often described as bloated. Where will our multiple economic reforms start to yield results? Well, joining me today to dissect this economic journey and explore the future are two experts, Amaka Anku, Africa head at Eurasia Group, who is still with us from the previous segment. She'll help me unpack some of the political and governance issues that have shaped our economic path, while Dr. Muda Yusuf, renowned economist and policy analyst, as well as CEO of the Center for the Promotion of Private Enterprise, will offer sharp insights on key policies and macroeconomic shifts. Well, get ready for a candid, data-driven conversation on Nigeria's economy at 64. Welcome to the show. Great to see
Thank
you,
you,
Dr. Yusuf. So, 64 years. Nigeria was born before some of us were. But the question I have for you, and I really want to start on the fact that our economy has been characterized by boom and bust cycles. Most of that has been tied to oil prices. So from an economic perspective, how do you think that history has impacted us today and led us to this point?
Well, I think we need to look at it from a number of perspectives.
Sure.
First is to look at what had happened to the private sector segment of the economy over time. Because the story of the economy is mixed in terms of outcomes. If you look at the Nigerian private sector, they have come a long way. If you look at some critical sectors, I mean, we are in broadcasting.
Sure.
Today we have over 700 broadcast stations. Close to 90% of them are private sector owned. If you look at the ICT sector, look at our financial services, the entertainment sector, the hospitality sector, quite a number of sectors. The footprint of the private sector has been phenomenal, in spite of all the challenges that they have been facing. Then we have the public sector component, although you say Amaka will do a lot more on that. The public sector has been a major issue over time because you need a very strong state to support economic transformation.
Of course, yes.
So, and I think after 1975, when we had that purge by Murtala Muhammad, the civil service and all of that, since then till now, the quality of our public service has been deteriorating. Not just the bureaucracy, even the political governance. And that has been a major drag, even to the private sector. Because sometimes, when you look at the quality of policies, the quality of state institutions, the quality of regulatory environment, even when you have the best of policies, because of the quality of the state, what you call state capacity, which Professor Osita referred to very recently, has been declining. And that has been a major issue.
Absolutely. But
generally, we are seeing some major structural shifts between independence and now. You refer to the agricultural sector. In 1960, the agri sector was accounting for about 64% of our GDP. Today, it's just about 22% of GDP. The manufacturing sector hasn't done so well, again, because of the structural issues and because the state has a major role to play in the structural environment. So we have not been able to, improve productivity the way we ought to have.
Indeed, and I think sort of listening to you, I'm picking up three. You talk about the structural shifts. The first one I wanted to kind of maybe get Amaka to comment on was the other major structural shift, which has been political, is that we've moved from an era of military regimes, military governments. And Amaka, since 1960, we've had that political weighing on our economic space. How would you assess how the impact of those political transitions have been on our ability to really fulfill our full economic potential? Are we still dealing with some of the remnants, even with the 1999 transition?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I would say, though, that, yeah, I mean, thinking about the political transitions, as you know, towards the end of Nigeria's many years of military dictatorship, Nigeria kind of became a pariah, right?
Yeah.
And so
and the global
there
community.
were sanctions, and then you had the very first democratic government in 1999 that came in with a lot of goodwill. And so I say that because a lot of people still remember that, go back and think, oh, OBJ's years, the best years. And I want to say something about that, which is that the politics of, like, when you came in with a lot of goodwill as the first democratic government in a time during an era where oil went from maybe $20 to $80 or $100, people were opening up around the world. There was a lot of excitement about Nigeria, so investment flowed in. The politics of that era is very different from anything Nigeria has ever experienced since.
Okay.
So it was normal that you would have like a lot more investment flowing, a lot more goodwill, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that what Nigeria has struggled to do since is figure out how to sustain that level of momentum and goodwill, right? Because of all the many challenges, because of the, I love what my co-panelist here was talking about earlier, which I think that there also has been a refusal on the part of Nigerian elites to acknowledge the need for a strong state.
Yeah. Okay, so that's interesting because, in free market economics, economic liberalism, reduce the size of the state is what we talk about. But on the other hand, the state needs to be an enabler of progress. It needs to be an enabler of economic reform. So Dr. Muda Yusuf, how do you balance that? And I want you to focus on sector growth because you talked about agriculture, you talked about, and some of that was state-led policies, actually. It wasn't all private sector driven at the time when agriculture was a mainstay of the economy. So how should the state function now? We've seen growth in telecoms over the years. We've seen growth in banking. Agriculture maybe is creeping back up, but it faces a lot of structural challenges. How should the state be positioning itself today to be an enabler of growth in some of our key sectors?
First of all, we need to worry about the way we populate the key actors in the public sector. I'm talking of the quality of appointments, recruitments, either into the bureaucracy or into the political leadership. Because if you don't have the right kind of people in terms of capacity and in terms of character, integrity, it will be extremely difficult for us to make the kind of progress that we seek to make. We need very strong state presence. I talked about structural issues.
Right.
If you talk to key operators in the economy, particularly in the real sector of the economy, part of the reasons why we have not made so much progress in agriculture, in manufacturing, and some key sectors like that is because we have very serious impediments in the structural space.
So you
and the structural
governance now? Is it governance?
No,
economic
governance,
management?
investment in infrastructure, because the state has to do some heavy lifting.
Yes.
In some key sectors for the private sector to be able to move on. There's a limit to what the private sector can do in terms of fixing infrastructure. There's a limit. There's a limit to what the private sector can do in terms of even ensuring that you have the right regulatory environment, even the macroeconomic environment. I was looking at some data here in the last 10 years, for instance. Our debt grew from, in 2015, our total debt was 12.6 trillion. Today, our total debt is 121.6 trillion. You know the implication of that for the macroeconomic environment.
Sure.
Again, look at money supply. Money supply in 2015 was 20 trillion.
Today we're at 100 trillion.
Today is 107 trillion. And when you have that kind of money supply space, and this is related to governance, it's largely a fiscal operation issue.
Right.
If you have this kind of situation and you are floating the currency, you can imagine the impact it will have.
Indeed. Yeah.
On practically all sectors of the economy, on the welfare of the citizens, on inflation, and so on. And all of these things has to do with the role of the state.
Yeah.
Then we talk about issues of poverty and all of that. Investing in social sector, education and health is the primary function of the state. But because the state has failed, we have seen the level of private sector involvement in that space, in education, in health. I'm not saying it's an entirely bad thing, but it's a reflection of the failure of the state.
That's an
and this is
interesting
where
point,
you build your human capacity.
Absolutely.
Your human capital.
Yeah. And you know, our human development indicators haven't been so great. I mean, compared to those countries that were considered our peers at independence. I'll come back to that because you mentioned some really important points about the private sector. Now, Amaka, the private sector, a large part of that private sector is foreign investment, right, that comes in. Some people would argue that one of the reasons Nigeria in the very early years, maybe after independence and even after the transition, was able to attract the level of foreign investment it saw was because of the oil price boom, right? And but because we've been through this boom and bust cycle, the question then becomes: is there enough meat here, an attraction for FDI beyond just the oil sector? And what do we need to do to ensure that we can attract and keep capital in the country?
So actually, I think that this question relates to your first question, which is that I think a lot of people underestimate the impact of politics on your ability to sustain economic growth. This is what I mean. You need to have your entire political and business elite buy into a theory of change.
Right.
Right? That's politics. That has to come from the top. It usually has to come with communication, a clarity about this is who we want to be. This is the kind of economic transformation we want to drive. This is the kind, we want to be the factory for the world, whatever, like how China was. Or we want to do, this is how we're going to do it. This is how we're going to invest in. And everybody needs to buy into that. Because what happens otherwise, so this is what happens otherwise, is that there is this, what we've seen in Nigeria, which is that we just talk ourselves down constantly. And the reason I start here is because you cannot attract foreign investment if your domestic business people do not believe in the direction of the country.
Right.
Right?
Because foreign investors see that as a signal.
Of course. It's a very important signal that I think is underappreciated in Nigeria. Who is going to come and invest if the people who live there don't think it's worth investing in?
But isn't part of the problem, and maybe Dr. Muda, you can also weigh in, isn't part of the problem is that Nigeria has thrived so much on getting the private sector to do things that people often throw around this phrase that everything happens despite or in spite of government. And so that alignment between the political and economic elite, there's no real incentive for the alignment because guess what? The economic elite just continue to do what they do. They build their industries, they build their businesses.
Because I'm very passionate about this. Nigerians, so I'm in a lot of these business forums, and when we go to NESG and annually, and the business community always complain, government get out of the way, you're incompetent, it's inefficient, people on social media always complain about this. But when you ask them, what are the things that are barriers, that are structural hampers to their business? It's all things that they want government to do. It's very inconsistent. We want better infrastructure. We want power, electricity. We want roads. These are not things that the private sector, like he was saying earlier, is set up to do. So there needs to be a mental shift in how we think of, when people hear strong government, all they hear is state control, right? Like it's like the scary monster. But it doesn't have to be. The freest markets exist in the shadow of a functioning state.
Absolutely.
The reason you have a market that exists is because you trust that if I enter into a contract with you, and you cheat me, I can go to court.
I have recourse to the courts, yes.
And guess what? This market doesn't work if there are no courts. People forget that. That's government,
Indeed,
right?
yeah.
That's official. So you have to have that as a basis, a competent state. And we also have to understand as Nigerians that you can walk and chew gum at the same time. Just because the current government we have is inefficient, and yes, lacks capacity in some places, doesn't mean we shouldn't be focused on making it better, smarter.
As opposed to ignoring
As opposed to saying it should get out of the way.
Indeed.
No, we need to do both. We need to figure out how to make it better at the same time as we're building up
very,
the
very
private
good
sector.
point. Dr. Muda Yusuf.
Talking about getting out of the way.
Yeah.
We see what damage the public sector presence has done to our oil and gas sector.
Okay, can you be more specific?
You know,
Yeah.
I mean, look, for instance, look at our refineries.
Okay.
Look at the government policies governing that sector over the last 20, 30 years. And all of this has led to a situation where we have a sector which normally should have formed a major leverage for the Nigerian economy to grow, just as is happening in some Middle East countries. But we so mismanaged the sector. We had a public sector dominance. The public sector and bureaucrats were running refineries, they were running critical. And look at where that has brought us today. So there are some key areas where truly the government needs to get out of the way.
Right.
Because that sector, for instance, turned out to be a major platform for patronage. People were giving oil blocks to friends, relations, and all of that. And we really lost it. We lost a great opportunity to properly unlock the opportunities in that sector, to support other sectors of the economy. So that is one example of where the government doesn't even need to get involved at all.
But can I ask you, and throw in something here,
Yes.
which may be a missing piece, is that the private sector, even if you bring the private sector to do the refineries or any of this big,
Yes.
they still have to interact with the institutions. So I want you to comment on the strength of our institutions, because they're often the interface, the agencies within government bureaucracy, within ministries and departments that interact with the private sector, that give them permits, operating permits and licenses. What is the state and strength of our institutions today, and what can we do to really make them strong? Because then politics wouldn't really matter if the institutions were strong and we saw that continuity.
Well, there's a connection between politics and even the institutions.
Right.
There's a very strong relationship. But, you know, we need very strong institutions, first, with respect to the conception of policy.
Okay.
Sometimes you have terrible policies because you don't have the right kind of capacity, either at the political level or at the level of the bureaucracy. You need very strong institutions, just as you said, very strong states, to have institutions that can support the market. You know, you talked about the judiciary. Yeah? You talk about regulatory environment. All of these things are a function of the quality of the state. And we talk about intervention, some of these sectors are not, because you have a state and a bureaucracy that has become highly transactional. I mean, talk to anybody that interacts as a business with the state agencies. There's a lot of transactional content in the way they come across. And we have to recognize that this is a very, very critical issue as far as making progress in this economy is concerned.
Right.
And I must commend Ike Mokede in this respect. He has a foundation. He has been doing a lot to build the capacity, you know, of the civil service.
Yeah, and I think he even has a scholarship for students who want to go into public administration.
Exactly. He's doing something that is novel because he recognizes that there's a major gap. No matter how brilliant your policies or your ideas are, if you have a civil service or a political structure that does not support the process, it's an issue. Then we also need to recognize the fact that as much as it is good to drive along this path of market principles, we need to realize and recognize the concept of market failure. In every market economy, there's always a market failure. And the essence of market failure is for you to recognize it and to get government to intervene to fill those gaps. There are so many things that the market cannot deliver.
Absolutely.
If you are talking about social impact on the people, we are talking about a policy regime that is leaving so many people behind, just as what we are having now with the current
And I
reforms.
think you make an important point, because I was going to talk about social development, but I noted, Amaka, you wanted to come in on the market failure.
No, I want to comment on your question, which is politics. You were saying, how do we make the institutions better? And because politics may not matter if they were better. And maybe this is a very predictable thing for me to say as a Eurasia Group analyst, but politics always matters.
Okay.
Because the things that you need to do to strengthen the state, to make better governance, better regulatory environment, is very political.
Okay.
Extremely political. You need to reform the civil service. He's talking about what Ike is doing. That is a very political thing to do, because there are lots of people who should be reassigned, right? You need to pay them better. Frankly, you're not going to get the talent you need unless you can pay. So that goes to your revenue generation, which is very political. right?
Right.
You need to get people to pay taxes, which is very political because they don't want to pay taxes because they think you're not delivering services. So I always talk about revenue. You need to have a better revenue. You need to pay your civil service better. You need to, I don't want to say fire people, maybe reassign people. Send some people to the field, get better people in some of these regulatory spaces, and then you can have. But that is the only way you can. These are things that are very difficult to do, and that our politicians never want to do because they're thinking about the next election in 4 years.
Yeah,
and that's why I go back to getting buy-in, because unless people really believe in the direction that you're going and your capacity to get there, they're not going to be willing to take that much pain. This is what's happening now, right? We're like, how far can they push all these price hikes before we see
so
protests?
I guess Dr. Muda, Yusuf, and Amaka, a lot of what there needs to be almost sort of, I wouldn't call it a social contract. Yeah. Well, there's a social contract between the political elite and ordinary Nigerians around welfare issues and service delivery. But there's also this whole idea that the state and the private sector have to work hand in hand. It's like a marriage. Yeah. You have to make it work and you have to deliver on that because nobody can do it alone. But at the heart of this, they say when two elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers, are actually ordinary Nigerians. Going back to my point on human development indices, that we've had this liberal free market approach for quite a while. We were the darling of the international community at one point, those glory years that people say 1999 to whenever, or even before. But yet, that level of traction has not quite delivered at the bottom of the pyramid. Now, is that problem of the bottom of the pyramid, is that a political problem? Is it the private sector not doing enough? Or does it go back to what we said around, as Nigerians, the political and business elite have to buy into the idea? Maybe there needs to be an ideological values. But why on social development are we doing so poorly?
You see, we need to have an ideological consensus on economic management. You see, it's not right and it's not appropriate, let me use that word, for you to take a model, particularly all these Western models of economic management, and copy and paste.
Which model are we operating?
We're operating pure, almost extreme of markets.
Okay.
Yes, we are talking about economic orthodoxy now.
Right.
That is where we have moved to. And it has very serious social consequences. And as we undertake a reform, and that is what has been missing, the IMF, the World Bank, they are not strong enough on the social consequences of a reform process. We have to worry about that. Because it's a developing economy. The social cost of the reform has been extremely very, very high. So as you undertake a reform, because the reform is not a destination, it's a process. And you have to tweak the reform to suit your own circumstances.
So which way forward? Because we're almost running out of time. So
yes.
I wanted Dr. Muda Yusuf, we've talked a lot, and a lot of this has centered around governance and the idea of state. But which way forward now for Nigeria? You're saying the current model doesn't work, of orthodoxy. What is the way forward now?
No, the way
Very
forward,
briefly.
the way forward comes back to what I said about failure of markets, identifying market failures, and government intervention. For instance, if you expose the citizens or businesses to the commercial banks, the CBN has been tightening interest rates. I was speaking to a major company, which you can regard as a blue chip company. They got an advice from a bank raising interest rate to 38%. What will now happen to SMEs?
Dr.
That's
Muda,
an example of market
sorry
failure.
to interrupt you because
Yes.
of time. I also wanted to, so we need to revisit the free market model.
Yes.
Amaka, very quickly, which way forward?
Look, ultimately, the responsibility for public service delivery lies with governments. That's how it is everywhere in the world.
Yeah.
So the way forward has to be that we need to acknowledge that the state's role is to provide public services and regulate the markets. That's the way forward.
Thank you. I wish we could continue this discussion. We were just getting into the meat of it. But thank you so much, Dr. Muda Yusuf and Amaka Anku, for those great insights. I feel like there should be a part 2, maybe when Nigeria is 132. I don't know if we're all here then, but quite a lot of work to do. Thank you so much for being with us, both of you. Well, that's all we have time for on Business Week, unfortunately. But you can continue the conversation on X. I'm Rolake Akinkube Filani. Do have a lovely rest of the weekend ahead.